It happened just minutes ago, the moment the monarchy changed forever. A trembling voice, a stunned silence, and a single line from Princess, and that left Prince Harry visibly broken. The man once called the People's Prince suddenly found himself completely, irrevocably out. No fanfare, no royal announcement. Just the weight of decades crashing down in one private conversation behind palace doors. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what could she have said? What secret had been buried for so long that it could destroy the fragile thread still tying Harry to his family? And why now, after years of silence, after so many public scandals, did Princess Anne choose this moment to speak? This isn't just another royal family drama. This is the story of a final reckoning. A king facing his legacy, a sister guarding a promise, and a son realizing too late that the truth doesn't always set you free. Imagine the scene, the echo of footsteps in the long marble hallway of Balmoral Castle. The air is thick with the scent of old oak and cold rain. Inside the drawing room, a fire crackles weakly. It does little to cut through the chill that hangs over the family. King Charles sits rigidly in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. Beside him, Princess Anne looks older, sharper, as though she's aged a decade overnight. And across from them stands Harry. Still, quiet, clutching a folded paper he doesn't yet realize will change his life forever. And clears her throat. The sound is barely more than a whisper, but it slices through the silence like a blade. "It's time," she says. That's when it began, the conversation that would end it all. Now, before we go any further, ask yourself, when did it all start to unravel? Was it the day Harry left the palace? The day he gave that explosive interview? Or was it much earlier, before Meghan Markle, before Megxit, before the Netflix cameras rolled and the memoir hit the shelves? Because according to sources close to the royal household, this ending was written long before the public even noticed the cracks. And the one person who knew it all along was Princess Anne. It's easy to forget she's the quiet one, the steady royal who never chases headlines, who carries out duty after duty with the same stoic calm that made her mother proud. But that calm hides something fierce, loyalty to the crown, to the late queen, to the oath she swore decades ago, to protect the monarchy, even from within. So when Anne walked into that room today, she wasn't just a sister. She was the keeper of her mother's final wish. But let's back up for a moment. Let's rewind to the events that led to this moment, because nothing in the royal world happens by accident. In the weeks leading up to this confrontation, royal insiders noticed an unusual pattern. Princess Anne and King Charles were meeting privately at Clarence House, often late into the night. Courtiers described their tone as grave, deliberate. Charles was said to look pale, his shoulders slumped, his usual patience replaced with something harder to name, dread. And when the Queen's old confidant, Lady Glenconner, was seen leaving the palace clutching a sealed envelope, speculation exploded. What was inside that envelope? And why was Anne the only one authorized to read it aloud? For days, the palace remained silent. The press circled like hawks, desperate for a soundbite. But behind closed doors, preparations were being made. Because according to whispers now confirmed by several insiders, that letter contained the Queen's final instruction, a message meant to be delivered after her passing, when the family would face its greatest test. That message was about Prince Harry. And the moment Anne read it, she knew she could no longer stay silent. But why wait until now? Why let the years of chaos unfold? The tell-all interviews, the strained coronation, the endless documentaries, before stepping in. The answer lies in the Queen's timing. Her instructions, reportedly handwritten and signed in her distinct cursive, were to be read only when the line of succession must be secured once and for all. And that time is now. When the meeting began earlier today, Harry was invited under the guise of a private family gathering. He arrived alone, sources say. No security detail, no Meghan. His expression was uncertain, hopeful even. Perhaps he believed this was the beginning of reconciliation. Perhaps he thought the rift could finally be mended. But what awaited him was something else entirely. And didn't waste words. She began by reading the Queen's message in full. The tone was gentle but unyielding, a mother's voice from beyond the grave, firm and clear. The letter spoke of duty, stability, and the preservation of the crown. And then came the line that silenced the room. For the sake of the monarchy, and to prevent the house from falling into public division, I entrust to my daughter and the responsibility of ensuring that only those who serve the crown remain bound by it. Those words, simple yet final, carried the meaning no one wanted to speak aloud. It meant that Harry, the rebellious prince who had stepped away, could no longer claim his royal standing. He was out. According to witnesses, Harry's face went white. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Even Charles couldn't meet his eyes. The king's hand trembled slightly, the only sign of emotion he allowed to escape, and folded the letter carefully, as though sealing the fate it carried. "Harry," she said quietly. This was her wish. And now, it must be done. It's hard to describe the stillness that followed. That thick, suffocating silence that falls when history shifts beneath your feet. Was this justice? Betrayal? Or simply the inevitable consequence of Harry's choices? Even now, the royal household hasn't issued an official statement. But insiders claim that legal steps are already being taken to formalize the Queen's instruction to officially remove Prince Harry from all remaining royal trusts and advisory roles. The symbolism couldn't be more striking. On one hand, a father forced to act as king. On the other, a son stripped of the one identity he never imagined losing. For years, Harry's rebellion was painted as a fight for freedom. But freedom, it seems, has a cost. And today, that cost came due. As the meeting ended, and reportedly stood to leave, she gave Harry a long, sorrowful look. For a brief second, it wasn't duty or protocol that filled the space. It was grief, the kind that only family can understand. She placed the Queen's letter on the table beside Charles and walked away without another word. Harry remained seated, frozen, his hands pressed against his knees, knuckles white. One aide who witnessed the moment said, "He looked like a man who had just realized the past can't be rewritten." Outside, the sky over Balmoral had turned gray. Rain began to fall softly against the windows, a quiet, almost poetic end to a royal chapter that began in scandal and ended in silence. But that silence didn't last long. Within minutes, whispers spread through palace staff. By the time Harry reached his car, journalists were already calling it the final cut. And if the reports are accurate, this isn't just symbolic. It's a constitutional move, one that removes Harry from future royal succession considerations entirely. It's unprecedented, unforgiving, and deeply personal. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story isn't the decision itself. It's the revelation that the Queen predicted all of it. In her private diaries, now rumored to be sealed in the royal archives, she allegedly wrote, "The crown must endure beyond sentiment. My love for my grandson is unending, but my duty is eternal." Those words echo now like prophecy. So where does that leave Harry? In California, far from the palace gates, far from the traditions that once defined him. A man without a title, a son without a kingdom. And yet, one question lingers. Who leaked this meeting? Who wanted the world to know? Because make no mistake, royal business this sensitive doesn't reach the public by accident. Someone wanted this story out. Someone wanted Harry to feel the full sting of exposure. Was it a senior palace aide? A communications strategist? Or perhaps someone closer? The royal family has long operated on unspoken rules, silence, loyalty, discretion. But as history shows, when those rules are broken, the consequences ripple far beyond the palace walls. This is more than a family rift now. It's a constitutional fracture, a moral reckoning, a moment where private pain becomes public spectacle. And the one person who saw it coming, who held the final key, was Princess Anne. Because beneath that calm, dutiful exterior beats the heart of a woman who understood her mother's greatest fear, that the crown might one day crumble under the weight of family betrayal. As we stand here now, one thing is certain, the Queen's legacy didn't end with her death. It's still unfolding, one heartbreak at a time. And as for Prince Harry, he's about to learn that when it comes to royal blood, love may be unconditional, but loyalty never is. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming that it was supposed to be an ordinary morning, as ordinary as royal mornings ever get. The staff moved quietly through the corridors of Balmoral, their shoes clicking against the polished stone, their voices hushed, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts of monarchs past. The air outside was heavy with fog, the kind that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. Inside, though, tension crackled like static in the air. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. And then came the call. Short, direct, unmistakable. King Charles had summoned the family. At first, no one thought much of it. Meetings among the senior royals were common, especially after recent public embarrassments. But there was something different about this one. The tone, the urgency, the fact that Princess and herself had made the calls instead of the king's private secretary. That wasn't protocol, that was personal. By noon, the family's most trusted aides knew something seismic was about to unfold. Harry's name was on the list. He was in California when the message reached him, and according to close friends, he hesitated. For several hours, he didn't respond at all. Why would he? Every time he'd walked back into the royal circle, it ended in silence, resentment, or scandal. But something about the message felt final. Anne's wording was deliberate. Your presence is requested. It's important. No threats. No demands. Just that phrase. It was enough to get him on a plane. As he crossed the Atlantic, those close to him said he seemed distracted, restless, even hopeful. Maybe this was the moment they'd finally forgive him. Maybe it was time to mend things. The thought must have felt like oxygen, fleeting, fragile, impossible not to believe in. But when Harry arrived, the castle didn't look like a place of reconciliation. There was no warmth in the greeting, no light in the corridors. The staff avoided eye contact, their hands clasped behind their backs. The usual polite murmurs of good afternoon, sir, felt mechanical, almost rehearsed. And then he saw her, Princess Anne, standing at the top of the grand staircase. Her expression gave nothing away. She was dressed in a dark navy suit, her hair pinned tightly, her face pale from lack of sleep. Her eyes, however, were something else entirely, sharp, steady, unflinching. Harry, she said, her voice calm. Thank you for coming. He hesitated. What's going on? You'll see soon enough, she replied. Inside the private drawing room, the king was waiting. Charles looked older, thinner, his complexion drawn. The strain of the crown was written across every line of his face. He didn't rise to greet his son, only nodded once, then gestured for him to sit, and closed the door behind them. The sound of the latch clicking was like a verdict. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, Anne reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. The royal seal glinted faintly under the light. She placed it on the table in front of them. This, she said, is Mother's letter. Harry's brow furrowed. You mean Granny's? And nodded. Written before she passed. To be read only when certain matters needed clarification. He frowned, confused. Clarification of what? And silence said everything. King Charles looked up, his voice quiet but heavy. Your grandmother wanted to ensure the monarchy remained stable, Harry. She had concerns. Harry's tone sharpened. Concerns about what? About me? Neither answered. So, and broke the seal. The sound of tearing wax echoed like thunder. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to read. To my family, I leave not only the crown, but the duty it carries. The throne cannot be divided by sentiment. Loyalty must outweigh emotion, and service must endure beyond scandal. Harry leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Scandal? What are you implying? And continued, ignoring him. For those who step away from their duties, who reject the role bestowed by birth, it must be clear they are no longer bound by the privileges or protections of the crown. A pause. A long, suffocating pause. Then Charles spoke. Harry, she meant you. Harry blinked, as though trying to process the words. What are you talking about? I left because I wanted peace. I didn't reject the family. Anne's voice softened but remained steady. You didn't just leave, Harry. You monetized the monarchy. You turned pain into profit. You spoke of family wounds to the world, and Mother saw that coming. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Harry shook his head. So that's it. One mistake, and I'm exiled forever. This isn't exile, Charles murmured. It's finality. That word, finality, hit him harder than any crown-shaped insult the press had ever thrown. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows. Inside, the fire hissed softly, and folded the letter back into its envelope, her eyes glistening now. Mother loved you, Harry. She never stopped. But she also knew the damage that could come if these divisions weren't settled. She wanted peace, and sometimes peace comes only through ending what's broken. Harry's voice rose, thick with emotion. You call this peace? This is abandonment. And didn't flinch. It's protection. For who? For everyone, she replied. Including you. For a moment, the room seemed to close in. Charles rubbed his temples, his voice barely audible. You may not believe this, but this hurts me too. You're still my son. Your son, Harry repeated bitterly. Who's not a prince anymore. Charles looked away. That was the moment it sank in. Not the betrayal, not the politics, but the cold, simple truth that he was no longer part of the institution that defined his entire life. He wasn't just losing a title. He was losing an identity. And yet, there was something else there, something unspoken. Anne's expression wasn't cruel. It was sorrowful, as if she knew this decision wasn't just for the monarchy's sake, but for Harry's survival too. Because as much as the family believed he'd turned his back on them, part of her knew he'd been driven there. By grief, by media, by love twisted into resentment. Still, the Queen's instructions were unambiguous. There was no room for interpretation. And placed the envelope in front of Charles. The decision is made. It only remains to sign. Harry's eyes followed the pen as Charles picked it up. His hand shook. He hesitated, maybe for the last time as a father. But then he signed. The scratch of the pen against paper was the sound of a dynasty closing its door. Harry didn't move. He didn't speak. When it was done, and stood, she walked over, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and said quietly, Mother always believed the truth would come to light. Today it has. He didn't look at her. What truth? That you were never meant to live in the shadow of this family, she said. And perhaps you were never meant to save it either. With that, she turned and left. The door clicked shut, leaving Harry and his father alone. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Charles sighed, a sound heavy with decades of regret. I never wanted it to come to this. Harry's response was quiet, but sharp as glass. Then why did you let it? Charles didn't answer. He simply looked at his son with eyes that had seen too much, the duty, the sacrifice, the mistakes. And perhaps in that moment, he knew he'd lost more than just a son, because the monarchy had demanded it, and the monarchy always wins. When Harry finally rose to leave, the envelope remained on the table between them, a small, silent monument to everything they'd lost. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. The chauffeur opened the car door, waiting silently as Harry climbed in. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Anne standing near the entrance, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met for just a second. She gave the slightest nod, not of defiance, but of resignation. He didn't nod back. The car door closed. The engine started. And just like that, Prince Harry, or perhaps simply Harry, was gone. Back inside the castle, and returned to the drawing room. Charles was still there, staring into the fire. He'll never forgive me, he said quietly, and replied, he'll forgive you one day. But he'll never understand. Charles looked up. Do you? And hesitated. I understand what Mother wanted. That's all that matters now. And as she turned to leave, her reflection in the window caught her eye. Tired, older, but resolute. The burden of truth was never light. But she had carried it long enough to know that silence, sometimes, was the cruelest act of love. Outside, the car carrying Harry disappeared into the mist. And somewhere, deep within the castle walls, a clock struck 3. The sound echoed through the corridors like an ending. But what no one realized yet was that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because the moment Harry left Balmoral, the palace's tight web of secrecy began to unravel, and what came next would drag every royal name into the storm. And no one, not even Princess Anne, was ready for what would follow. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. There's a reason Princess Anne has always been called the firm's iron heart. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't waver. And when it comes to the survival of the monarchy, she never hesitates. But what few realize is that beneath that iron exterior lies a story few dared to tell. A story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbearable burden of truth. Because if anyone in that family knows the cost of silence, it's Anne. And the day she delivered her mother's final message to Harry, she wasn't just following orders. She was fulfilling a promise made decades ago, one sealed in grief, duty, and love. The cameras never caught it, but insiders swear and changed that day. The moment she stepped into Balmoral's drawing room, the steady, stoic woman known for her sharp tongue and relentless work ethic became something else, the Queen's chosen executor. Not of a state, but of destiny. It all began long before that dreadful day, years before the world ever heard the term Megxit, back when Queen Elizabeth II was still alive, quietly watching her family unravel in slow motion, and had always been the closest thing the Queen had to a mirror, pragmatic, dutiful, emotionally reserved. Where Charles was poetic and was practical, where Andrew was reckless and was restrained, and where Edward sought approval and simply did what needed to be done. Even as a child, she was different. While her brothers squabbled over attention, she spent her mornings riding horses in the damp English fog, her afternoons shadowing her father at naval ceremonies, and her evenings studying the small details of royal life most people never noticed. The way her mother's tone changed during state dinners, how her father would glance toward her mother before speaking publicly, how silence often said more than words ever could. That was the foundation of her loyalty. She understood that being royal wasn't about privilege. It was about endurance. So when Queen Elizabeth summoned into a private meeting at Windsor, just 2 months before her passing, and knew it wasn't going to be casual tea, the Queen's health had been declining. Her voice was weaker, her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, but her eyes, those sharp, discerning eyes, still held the same authority that had kept an empire together for 70 years. "My dear," the Queen began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I am gone, things will not be as they were," and remained silent. She knew what her mother meant. She didn't need to ask. "There will be unrest," the Queen continued, "and words spoken that cannot be unsaid. The unity we've guarded may fracture, and not at once. I've seen it coming." "I know you have," the Queen said, "and that is why I must ask something of you." The Queen reached into a small box on the table beside her and withdrew an envelope sealed with red wax. "This must be delivered when the time comes. You'll know when that is," and stared at it for a long time before taking it. "And if it concerns Harry?" The Queen hesitated, her eyes softening. "Then let him know I loved him dearly. But love cannot guide a crown. Only duty can." It was the closest and had ever seen her mother come to tears. That was the day and made her promise to deliver the truth, no matter how painful. From that moment, every glance she exchanged with Harry carried the weight of something unsaid. She watched him at family events, his easy laugh, his jokes, his flashes of anger. She saw the rift widen each year, and though her face betrayed nothing, her heart knew exactly how this would end. When Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from royal duties and didn't say a word publicly, but behind closed doors, she warned Charles, "Once you let him go, he won't come back. Not as your son, not as your heir." Charles had sighed. "He just needs space. Space is what killed Diana," and replied quietly, "Don't give him too much of it." Her warning went unheeded. And as the years rolled on, the gap between father and son became a canyon. Still, and never took sides. She neither defended Harry nor condemned him. Her loyalty was to something larger, the institution itself. People often mistake her coldness for cruelty, but those who know her understand better. Anne's heart is loyal to one thing, the continuity of the monarchy. And in her mind, that meant doing whatever it took, even if it meant being the villain in someone else's story. When Queen Elizabeth passed, the palace was consumed with ceremony and grief. But Anne barely had time to mourn. She carried out her mother's instructions with mechanical precision, traveling alongside the coffin, ensuring protocol was followed to the letter. Yet through it all, she never once let the envelope out of her sight. It traveled with her, from Balmoral to Edinburgh, then to London, tucked safely away, like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. Staff noticed her quietness during that period. She spoke little, smiled even less. She kept to her duties, but something in her demeanor had shifted. It wasn't just sorrow, it was anticipation. She knew the moment was coming. And when Charles ascended the throne and became not just his sister, but his confidant, the one person who could speak to him without fear, she reminded him, often, of what their mother had said. The crown must endure beyond sentiment. Charles hated that phrase. It made him feel less human, more machine. But Anne knew it was true. Behind the scenes, she began preparing for what she dreaded most, the confrontation with Harry. Not out of malice, but inevitability. When the Queen's secret instruction was finally unsealed and read it in private, alone, in her study, she poured herself a cup of tea, stared at the folded parchment for several minutes, and finally opened it. What she read made her heart ache, not because of the words themselves, but because she knew she'd have to be the one to deliver them. The Queen's handwriting was precise, elegant, deliberate, every word chosen with care. The message wasn't cruel. It was compassionate in the way only the Queen could be, but it was also absolute. She wrote of her love for Harry, her admiration for his courage, and her sorrow over the choices he'd made. But then she wrote something and would never forget. There comes a point when the love of family must yield to the love of the crown. I trust you, and to know when that point has arrived. And read those words again and again until she knew them by heart. That night, she didn't sleep. She paced her study, thinking of the boy who used to follow her around the stables, laughing and calling her Auntie Annie. She remembered teaching him how to ride, how he'd fall off the pony and get back up with that cheeky grin. She remembered how proud his mother had been, and how deeply his father had loved him in his quieter moments. And now, all of it was gone. By morning, her decision was made. She would keep her promise. So when the day of the meeting arrived, and wasn't acting out of authority, she was acting out of duty, one passed down by a mother who knew her daughter's strength better than anyone else. Still, carrying that truth didn't make it easier. When she saw Harry's face in the drawing room, the hope, the nervousness, a small part of her wanted to lie, to tell him this was all a misunderstanding. But she couldn't, not when the survival of everything their family had built was at stake, and understood something Harry never could, that in the monarchy, love and loyalty often stand on opposite sides of the battlefield. When she read the letter aloud, her voice remained steady, but inside, she was breaking. She saw the hurt in Harry's eyes, the disbelief, the betrayal. And though she didn't show it, each word felt like driving a nail into a coffin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Because this wasn't about comfort, it was about preservation. Afterward, when she left the room and closed the door behind her, she didn't go far. She stood in the hallway for a long time, her hand resting on the cool marble wall. One of the footmen approached, asking if she was all right. She simply said, "No one ever is when they do what's right." Later that evening, and walked the gardens alone. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp, clinging to her clothes. She paused by a statue of her mother, the one recently erected near the palace grounds, and whispered, "It's done." A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of lavender, the Queen's favorite. For a fleeting moment, and felt peace. But deep down, she knew the storm was only beginning, because the truth she had just unleashed would not remain contained. And once the world learned what she had done, her loyalty would be questioned, her motives dissected, and her heart misunderstood. Still, she had no regrets. Loyalty isn't about comfort. It's about endurance. It's about standing alone when everyone else falters. And if Princess Anne had to carry the weight of that truth alone, she would do it, just as her mother did before her. But as she walked back toward the castle, a single light flickered in the upper window, the king's study. He was still awake, waiting, thinking, and in the distance, the faint sound of a car fading into the night. Harry's car, for the first time in decades, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, uncertainty. Had she protected the crown, or destroyed what was left of the family? The question echoed in her mind as she entered the palace and closed the door behind her. But what came next would make even her question her loyalty, because the Queen's secret wasn't the only one buried in Balmoral. And when the next truth surfaced, it wouldn't just break Harry, it would break the monarchy itself. They say a monarch's words can outlive the monarch herself. But what happens when those words are never meant to see the light of day? The answer lies in a document so secret, so carefully hidden, that even the closest royal aides didn't know it existed, until now. The Queen's hidden memo. It wasn't a letter written out of sentiment, nor a diary entry meant for her heirs to stumble upon. No, this was different. It was a private memorandum, drafted in the twilight of her reign, sealed within the depths of the royal archives. And it held the key to everything: the rift between Charles and Harry, the burden and carried, and the reason the monarchy made its most brutal decision yet. The story of this memo begins months before Her Majesty's passing. At that time, the Queen had already begun to withdraw from public life. Her steps were slower, her audiences shorter. But her mind remained sharp as ever. Her aides described how she would sit by the window in Windsor Castle, staring out over the gardens, silently dictating her thoughts to her private secretary, Sir Edward Young. One of those afternoons, she'd been particularly quiet. When Young asked if she was unwell, she simply said, "No, Edward." Just reflective. She took a deep breath, adjusted her glasses, and began to speak. "What we build," she said, "must outlast us. And if it is to outlast us, it must be protected, even from those we love." That was how the memo began. According to a palace archivist, the Queen dictated 6 pages, each one filled with careful, deliberate handwriting. Her words carried no bitterness, no anger, only foresight. She spoke of transition, of unity, of truth. But she also spoke of the danger of modernity, the way it threatened to erode centuries of royal mystique. And woven through every line was Harry. He was her grandson, her darling boy, as she often called him privately. But in the memo, she referred to him as the Wanderer. Not in scorn, but in sorrow. "The Wanderer," she wrote, "who believes his freedom is the crown's enemy, not its creation." That phrase alone revealed more about her feelings than years of royal statements ever could. She admired Harry's compassion, his desire to connect, his willingness to challenge the institution. But she also feared what that rebellion might cost. And she was right. In the memo, she expressed grave concern over the growing distance between her grandsons. She described how the bond that once symbolized the future of the monarchy had turned into its greatest vulnerability. "Where unity once stood as our strength," she wrote, "division now casts a shadow upon the realm." The Queen was not naive. She knew history. She'd lived through abdications, scandals, betrayals, and the death of Diana, the wound that had never truly healed. So she wrote what she always did in moments of crisis: instructions. It was in her nature to plan for what others couldn't bear to imagine. And this time, her instructions were more than just guidance. They were a directive. She ordered that, upon her death, a sealed memo be given to her daughter, Princess Anne. Not to Charles, not to William, but Anne. Because Anne, she said, is the only one who will act without emotion. The Queen's staff were told that the memo must remain hidden unless the monarchy faced what she termed irreparable division. And by the time 2025 arrived, that moment had come. When the media frenzy surrounding Harry's explosive interviews began, senior courtiers reportedly urged the king to respond, to defend the crown publicly. But Charles refused. "Mother would have wanted restraint," he said, and disagreed. She went to the archives, to the very vaults beneath Windsor where the Queen's personal writings were kept. She requested access to Box 73, a restricted container marked with the Queen's initials. Inside were several handwritten letters, speeches, and one sealed envelope stamped with crimson wax. Her breath caught when she saw it. It was labeled simply, "For the day when truth must outweigh tenderness," and opened it slowly. Inside, she found the 6-page memo, every word still as precise as the day it was written. She read it once, twice, and by the 3rd time, tears had blurred her vision. Because the Queen hadn't just anticipated the family conflict, she'd predicted the exact way it would unfold. "She will guide him," the memo said, referring to Meghan Markle. "But her compass points to freedom, not duty. And his heart, if unanchored, will drift toward whichever voice promises belonging." And set the papers down, her mind racing. The Queen had seen everything before it happened: the interviews, the books, the global spectacle. And in the final paragraph, the Queen left no room for interpretation. "If the day comes when the realm's faith in its heirs wavers, when one turns against the other, and the crown itself becomes a stage, not a sanctuary, then it must be made clear: service is not a choice one resumes at leisure. It is a bond eternal or broken." That single sentence became the spine of the decision that followed. And knew then that the time her mother had warned about, the day when truth must outweigh tenderness, had arrived. The irony, of course, was brutal. The Queen's greatest strength had always been her restraint. She rarely expressed emotion, rarely interfered in personal matters. Yet this memo, written in private, revealed more of her inner conflict than the public ever saw. She loved her grandson deeply, but she loved the monarchy more. It was the same painful choice her uncle, Edward VIII, had once faced, but inverted. Where Edward chose love and lost the crown, Elizabeth chose duty and preserved it. And now, that same impossible choice had passed to her daughter. In the weeks before the Balmoral meeting, and carried the memo everywhere. Not out of paranoia, but reverence. She locked it in her briefcase during public events. She read it late at night in her study, sometimes aloud, as if rehearsing her mother's voice. At times, she doubted herself. She wondered if the monarchy was worth this level of heartbreak. But each time, she returned to the same words the Queen had once spoken to her privately. When the duty is hardest, that's when it matters most. The palace staff began to notice and change in demeanor. She was sharper, more curt than usual. Some thought she was angry at Charles. Others whispered she was disappointed in Harry. The truth was far simpler. She was carrying a truth she couldn't share. Until the morning came when she knew she had to. When she met with the king before the confrontation, she laid the memo on his desk. Charles stared at it for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. "I thought this was just a rumor," he said. "It's real," Anne replied. "And you know what it means." He exhaled heavily. "Mother, even in death, she's still guiding us." "No," Anne said quietly. "She's still protecting us." For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant sound of rain against the window. Then Charles nodded, understanding what had to be done. And just like that, the memo, 6 pages written by a monarch trying to preserve her legacy, became the catalyst for one of the most painful royal confrontations in modern history. The public will never see that memo. It will remain locked away in the archives, sealed under royal prerogative. But those who have read it say it ends with one haunting line, one that still echoes through the palace halls today. History will not remember who was hurt, only who endured. That line haunted and long after she delivered her mother's message. Because deep down, she knew endurance always comes with a cost. And this time, that cost was her brother's son. What no one outside the palace realized, however, was that the Queen's memo wasn't the only secret document tied to Harry's fate. There was another, one Charles himself had written years before, long before he ever wore the crown. A royal decree never meant to see daylight. And when that document resurfaced, it would not only confirm the Queen's fears, it would seal Harry's fate once and for all. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For most of his life, King Charles was a man torn between two worlds, the one he inherited and the one he wished he could create. A monarch by birth, a father by heart, a peacemaker by instinct. But in the cold silence of Balmoral that morning, none of that mattered anymore. He wasn't sitting on a throne. He wasn't surrounded by the ceremony or the pomp that had defined his reign. He was simply a man, aging and exhausted, holding a pen that would end his son's place in history. And that pen felt heavier than the crown itself. When Anne placed the Queen's memo before him, the king didn't immediately read it again. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every word already, each line seared into his conscience like scripture. The final instruction, the moral commandment, service is not a choice one resumes at leisure. It is a bond eternal or broken. It was the line that broke him, because Charles knew what it meant. He knew that by obeying his mother's wish, he would not only protect the monarchy, he would lose his son forever. For a man whose life had been a series of compromises, this was the one decision he couldn't compromise on. He sat in silence for a long time, the fire flickering in front of him, the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. The scent of rain drifted in from the window, mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke. Every sound seemed amplified, the ticking of the clock, the faint rustle of Anne's clothing, his own heartbeat in his ears. "Is it really necessary?" he asked quietly, and stood across from him, her hands clasped. "You know it is. He's still my son." "I know." Charles's voice cracked slightly. "Then why does it feel like I'm being asked to choose between my son and my mother?" Anne's tone softened. "Because you are." That was the brutal truth of monarchy. Every generation must sacrifice something sacred. For Elizabeth, it had been her marriage. For Charles, it was his family. The king rose from his chair and walked toward the window, staring out at the rain-soaked hills. "I thought she was done shaping my life," he murmured. "But she's still here, isn't she?" still telling me what I must be. And said nothing. He turned to her, his eyes wet but unyielding. You were always the strong one, and Mother trusted you with her hardest truths because she knew you wouldn't falter. But he hesitated, shaking his head. I've faltered all my life. And took a small step closer. You've done what you thought was right. That's all any of us can do. Charles gave a faint, weary laugh. And yet somehow, it's never enough. He walked back to the desk, his gaze falling on the sealed document lying beside the Queen's memo. It was one of his own, a letter drafted years earlier, long before the world had heard of Megxit, before Harry's marriage, before the endless interviews. It was a contingency plan, written when Charles was still Prince of Wales, outlining the potential removal of any royal who knowingly endangers the dignity of the crown through commercial or political misconduct. It had been meant as a safeguard, not a weapon. But now it was both. He placed his hand on the letter, the parchment rough under his fingers. This was never meant for him, he whispered, and tilted her head slightly. Maybe that's why it must be. He looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. You can't build a kingdom on exceptions, Charles, and continued. Mother knew that. You do too. He swallowed hard. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. It's duty. For a moment, Charles said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly, sat back down, and pulled a pen from the drawer. His hand hovered over the page, trembling. The act of signing a royal decree had always been a formality, ceremonial, distant. But this was different. This was personal. This wasn't a law, it was a loss. He could hear his mother's voice echoing in his mind, calm, unwavering. The crown is not a comfort. It is a calling. He signed. And just like that, it was done. The ink bled slightly across the paper, spreading like a bruise, and stood still, watching in silence. She didn't smile. She didn't move. When the last letter was formed, Charles set the pen down and stared at his signature. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, and broke the silence. History will thank you. Charles's voice was a whisper. My son won't. And hesitated, then said quietly, history lasts longer. That was how the monarchy worked. Not through affection, but through endurance. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, rattling the windows. It was as if nature itself was mourning the decision. Charles closed his eyes, the weight of it sinking in. Do you think she would be proud? Anne's response was immediate. She'd say it was necessary. He gave a sad smile, which is the same thing. Later, when Anne left the room, Charles remained seated by the fire, staring into the flames. The room felt unbearably quiet now. He could almost hear Harry's laughter from years ago. A child running through the palace corridors, shouting for his father to chase him. A memory that now felt like a cruel echo. He rubbed his eyes and whispered, I've done what I must. But the words sounded hollow. There was a knock on the door. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered. Your Majesty, shall I have it delivered to the Privy Council for formal registration? Charles hesitated. Not yet. Not today. May I ask why, sir? Because once it leaves this room, the king said softly, It becomes history. And I'm not ready for that yet. Sir Clive nodded and withdrew, leaving the king alone once more. Hours passed. The rain outside turned to mist, wrapping the castle in an eerie stillness. The fire burned low. Charles sat unmoving, the papers spread out before him like a battlefield map. He picked up the Queen's memo again, tracing the edge of the parchment with his fingers. It was strange. He could almost hear her voice in the words, the quiet authority that had shaped his entire life. Protect the monarchy, she'd written, even if it costs you your heart. And that was exactly what it had done. But as he read further, he noticed something he hadn't before, a small handwritten note in the margin. Faded ink, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right. It read, "Forgive them before they ask." His heart skipped. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Was it a message to him? To Anne? To the family? He couldn't tell. But those 5 words, "Forgive them before they ask," pierced through every layer of royal conditioning he'd ever known. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then he rose and walked toward the window again. Outside, the fog was lifting. Through the gray, he could see the faint outline of the royal gardens, the same ones his mother had once tended to herself. He whispered, "I'll forgive him, Mummy. I just don't know if I'll ever see him again." At that exact moment, a knock echoed from the hall. Anne's voice followed, quiet but urgent. "Charles, it's done. He's gone." The words hung in the air like a ghost. Charles didn't turn around. He just nodded once, his reflection pale in the window. Then so be it. And with that, the King of the United Kingdom, the man who had waited a lifetime for his crown, stood utterly alone, victorious in duty, defeated in love. He knew the public would never know this side of the story, the trembling hands, the sleepless nights, the unseen tears. They would only know the headlines. Prince Harry officially removed from royal roll by King Charles. But behind those headlines was a father who'd broken his own heart to preserve the one thing he could never control, the legacy of the crown. That night, as he prepared to retire, and found him in the corridor. She didn't speak at first, just handed him a glass of water. "You did what you had to," she said softly. He nodded. "So did you." There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Do you think he'll hate us forever?" Charles looked at her, the faintest hint of a sad smile crossing his lips. "Forever is a long time, and maybe one day he'll understand. Maybe one day he'll thank us." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. As the doors to his private chambers closed, the king glanced once more at the fire flickering in the distance. The flames had burned low, reduced to embers, small, stubborn, still alive. He wondered if that was what his family had become, glowing faintly in the dark, not yet extinguished, but too fragile to warm anyone anymore. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, beneath the same heavy sky, his son sat in silence, unaware that the man who had just cut him off from the crown was also the only one left still praying for him. But what came next would make even the king question the very foundations of the monarchy, because what it discovered after that day would reveal a truth far darker than duty. And this time, there would be no forgiveness left to give. Every royal story has a shadow. And in this one, it wears a smile that could charm a nation and a history that could divide one. While the world focused on King Charles and Princess Anne's decision, there was someone else at the heart of the storm. Someone who had shaped it long before the memo was ever opened. Meghan Markle. To understand the king's final decision, you have to understand the woman who walked into the royal circle and changed it forever. To Harry, she was love, fresh, fearless, and defiant. To the monarchy, she was chaos wrapped in elegance. And she was a ticking clock. It wasn't hatred that defined the relationship between Meghan and the royal family. It was misalignment. Meghan wasn't born into centuries of quiet duty. She came from a world where emotion was expression, not burden, where telling your truth was liberation, not rebellion. And from the very first day she entered the royal world, she shattered its silence. And noticed it immediately, the first time Meghan visited Sandringham and observed her from across the room. The young Duchess was charming everyone in sight, staff, cousins, even the usually aloof Edward. But beneath that grace, and saw something else, calculation. Not malice, not manipulation, simply purpose. Meghan wasn't performing, she was positioning. That evening, after the guests had retired, and made a remark to her mother. "She's different," she said quietly. The queen, still sharp in her old age, gave a small nod. So were you once. And shook her head. Not like this. She wasn't wrong. Within months, the palace dynamic shifted. The press adored Meghan at first. She was a breath of fresh air, a modern icon. But admiration turned into scrutiny faster than anyone anticipated. The tabloids that once celebrated her now picked her apart piece by piece. Her past, her family, her ambition, and understood the cruelty of the press better than anyone. She had lived through it herself. But what worried her wasn't the media's obsession, it was how Meghan handled it. Instead of silence, Meghan fought back. Instead of retreating, she spoke louder. And in doing so, she broke one of the monarchy's oldest rules. Never explain, never complain. And that rule wasn't about arrogance. It was about preservation. The monarchy's power lies in mystery. But Meghan's openness was a light too bright for a family built on shadows. And Harry followed that light wherever it led. The more she spoke, the more he withdrew. The palace dinners grew quieter. Invitations became formal instead of familial. Every statement from Harry was now vetted by his wife's advisors. It wasn't a partnership, it was a movement. When Meghan told the world in that televised interview that the royal institution didn't protect me, and reportedly watched from her sitting room, the television volume low, the curtains drawn. She didn't react outwardly, but those who knew her said she muttered only 5 words under her breath. That's not how we do this. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper because it comes from a place of care. You see, and doesn't despise Meghan. In truth, she respects her intellect, her tenacity. But she also understands something Meghan never did. The monarchy isn't designed to be changed by emotion. It survives because it refuses to. And yet, in her own way, Meghan succeeded where many before her failed. She exposed the royal family's most fragile truth, that its members are human. That behind the gilded portraits and perfect postures, there are cracks, heartbreaks, and bruises no one wants to admit. But for the Queen and Anne, that exposure wasn't liberation, it was danger. Because once the world sees a crown as human, it stops being divine. Behind closed doors, and warned Charles. If this continues, she said, the crown won't need enemies. It will destroy itself from within. Charles agreed. But as usual, he hesitated. He loved his son too much to act decisively. So the burden fell to Anne. And the shadow of Meghan grew larger. After the couple's departure to California, the palace scrambled to contain the damage. For the first time in decades, senior officials considered revising the line of succession. The Queen refused at first. But after her passing, the idea returned with renewed force, especially once Meghan's new ventures began making headlines. Documentaries, interviews, memoirs, all branded with royal names, all dripping with controversy. The palace couldn't compete. Every attempt to stay silent made them look colder. Every effort to defend themselves made them look guilty. And behind every headline, there she was, Meghan Markle, shaping the story while standing oceans away. Princess, and never said it aloud, but those closest to her claim she saw it all as inevitable. Meghan is not evil, she once confided to a friend. She's just doing what she was raised to do, survive. But in her world, survival looks like rebellion. That line, survival looks like rebellion, would echo through every decision and made after that. Because when the time finally came to deliver the Queen's memo, and knew exactly what it meant, the document wasn't just about Harry's choices, it was about Meghan's influence. The Queen had seen it coming. She'd seen how love could become leverage, how loyalty could bend under pressure. Guide him, the Queen had written, but do not let him drift. But Meghan's guidance had turned into distance. And distance, for the monarchy, was death. In the weeks leading up to Harry's final removal, and reviewed every public statement the couple had made. She didn't do it out of spite. She did it to prepare herself, to see if there was any trace of remorse, any sign that Harry still wanted to come home. There wasn't. What she found instead were sound bites about toxic institutions and breaking generational cycles. Meghan's words were crafted, polished, powerful, but they carried a subtext the palace couldn't ignore: condemnation. And perhaps the most damning part wasn't what Meghan said. It was what she made Harry believe, that love and duty couldn't coexist. And, of all people, understood that heartbreak. She had lived her entire life balancing affection and obligation. But Harry didn't understand that balance. He had been raised on emotion, not endurance. When he met Meghan, she gave him something he'd never had, someone who told him that love didn't have to hurt. And after years of living under the palace's iron silence, he believed her. But the cost of that belief was steep. Every act of defiance pulled him further from the family, until reconciliation became impossible. The Queen saw it, and felt it, and Charles feared it. By the time and stood in that Balmoral drawing room, she wasn't confronting Harry the grandson. She was confronting Harry, the man reshaped by Meghan's world. And yet, despite everything, part of her couldn't hate the Duchess. Because in a twisted way, Meghan had given Harry exactly what he'd always wanted: freedom. The only problem was, freedom doesn't exist in the royal lexicon. As Anne left the meeting that day, she thought about something the Queen once told her after Diana's death. The problem with love, her mother had said, is that it demands to be louder than duty. But in this family, duty must always shout louder. Now, watching Harry's life unfold from a distance, and wondered whether that truth had finally expired. Maybe love had become louder. Maybe that was why everything was falling apart. Later that night, she received a private call from an old palace insider, someone who had once served as one of Meghan's aides. The voice on the line was hesitant. "Ma'am, I thought you should know. There's a recording." And froze. A recording of what? The Queen's letter. Someone leaked it. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. That memo was supposed to be locked under the strictest confidentiality. Only 3 people had seen it: Anne, Charles, and one senior archivist. But if what the aide said was true, then someone else had a copy. And within days, whispers began to spread through the tabloids. A hidden royal document, a dying queen's words, and a secret that could end a prince's title forever. Meghan hadn't leaked it herself. She was too smart for that. But her world, her media network, her connections, someone close to her had found a way. Anne's stomach sank. She had delivered her mother's truth to protect the crown. But now that truth was being weaponized against it. The Queen's words would soon become headlines. Her wisdom turned into ammunition. And for the first time since this ordeal began, Anne felt something she hadn't felt in years: fear. Because once that memo went public, there would be no hiding behind the palace gates anymore. The world would know that the Queen herself had orchestrated Harry's removal long before the king signed anything. And once that happened, the monarchy's silence would look like deceit. And stood by the window that night, watching the moonlight spill over the damp grass. She whispered her mother's words, half prayer, half plea. The crown must endure beyond sentiment. But this wasn't sentiment anymore. This was exposure. And as dawn approached, she realized something chilling. Meghan's shadow wasn't just over Harry anymore. It was over the monarchy itself. And what came next would turn that shadow into a storm no crown could.